who was the brother of Jeff Montgomery and who
produced the film also.
Produced the film, and is the genesis of the film. I want to thank you again. This is the second time I've seen this film, and I've cried every time. So
I'm still crying every time.
You really made. I knew of Jeff. I did not know him in life, and you really. I felt like I met someone and lost him. I mean, that's how intimate and personal and profound this film was. I think you really showed us who he was. So we're gonna now chat about it a little bit. So. This movie was your idea.
Yeah, but at one point, when I had my own restaurant, went out of business, and at the same time Jeff was getting sick, and that's when I became his caretaker. And we started talking about what he wanted to do. And he had ideas like a lecture tour. And then Daniel got involved, and he said, no, this is a movie. And there you go.
So what, tell us about why you knew his story had to be told.
Well, just being with him for the length of time as a caretaker and listening to him and the people we meet, it's an incredible story. It's as relevant today, if not more relevant than it was 9 years ago when we started this. And it just seemed like it'd be a great story.
Daniel, tell us about that moment when y'all realized this is a movie, this is big, this is a bigger story than one lecture or even a tour.
Well, so I'm coming from the outside here, and we were introduced by a mutual friend, and John and Jeff. I think I mentioned it at the top of the presentation here, but they came over and really started to lay out what it was that Jeff had done. I started to hear from him and started to get to know him a little bit.
Oh no, it's not working. You
I'll
must
just speak up
louder.
Yeah.
But really throw it out.
Yeah. So it was very clear. I mean, right immediately, it was clear that like this was an extraordinary human being, right? And just in the room, as far as like someone you wanted to talk to, and wanted to listen to, and wanted to ask questions to, and everything. But he also had this incredible history. And then the real thing, I think I mentioned this at the top, but he just said like that he didn't want to control it because he wanted it to be like legit. He didn't want it to be like something that he was in charge of. So those things all together really told me that like, this was something that I had to get involved in, and I had to try to do what I could to tell the story.
What helped you know that Daniel was the right person to tell this story?
We're not to yell, I think so. We'll just kill that.
Thank you, Sandy.
I think I said, how did you know that Daniel was the right person to tell the story?
Well, as we met him and got involved working with him, you could just tell his commitment was there. There was like almost magic between the three of us, and it was there.
So we got to know Jeff pretty well watching this movie, but tell us a little bit about what it was like to grow up with him.
Well, it was a lot of fun. That's what the whole family was. But like, I'm like 5.5 years older than him. So say when I went to college, he was 12. So he had the big personality already, but it was like he was my little brother, and the gay part hadn't come into play yet.
He had mentioned in the movie that it was very easy for him to come out, that your family was very accepting. Can you talk a little bit about that time and how that happened?
Well, he was engaged to be married, and he didn't want to go through it. He had to really make a huge decision, and he broke off the wedding and basically came out. And, my father was totally acceptable. His big concern was that Jeff made an announcement in the newspaper about it. And my father's big concern was that it might cost his career. But otherwise, the family was totally accepted. And like for me and my brother James, we discovered it before it even came out. In the house we grew up in, there was 3 bedrooms. Mine and James's were in the back, and there was a little hole in the wall between them. And we'd stash like our Playboys and stuff there. So one day James came home from college, he went to the spot, and there were like men's magazines. So James said, picked up on it earlier. But he had a big personality, even at whatever grade he was in. He was president of the class. And at that time, he graduated in '71. The gay issues weren't a factor yet.
So as he got older and he started to get into the activism work, were you guys worried about him? Were you scared for him?
No, because he was totally committed to it, totally dedicated to it. Every once in a while, you'd have a concern, but that was him. And as you saw in the movie, he got the death threat, and he was killed on stage. It didn't bother him, and he just totally committed.
Did he tend to tell you guys about that stuff at the time, or did you find out later, oh, I have a death threat, this because of
I found that out making the movie. I knew about the Indianapolis one, because that was a big thing, because it's not in the movie, but he was able to ditch the guy that was following him around and ended up with a nice night in a bathhouse in Indiana.
Daniel, I know you said he admirably said he didn't want editorial control over the film and he wanted you to tell a real story, but it must have been a fascinating and challenging process to work with someone who was such an active participant in telling their own story. Can you talk about that dynamic of working with someone who had that big personality, who had that quick, brilliant mind that could synthesize all these events, and what just that process of distilling a life story out of it?
Well, what was so interesting with Jeff was he could talk about anything, and he was the most amazing sort of just person to converse with, like on any topic ever. I mean, in fact, this is something that didn't make it into the film, but there's, I met up with, I would interact with people who had been his bartenders in the later parts of his life. Who were like, I talked to that guy every day for, or like a couple times a week for like years, had no idea he'd done all this stuff in his life. Because he was a very humble person. He didn't he was just a guy. He was just this super interesting guy that could talk about anything at the bar, But as far as I may have lost track of your question a little bit, but
what was the process of interviewing, putting together this movie, of distilling
well,
story?
we had a framework originally that we were going to have this big interview, and that was what was done with Craig Foley. And it was this big 3-hour interview, it was a big marathon session. And that's really what kind of cracked the whole thing open. We originally had this idea of just illustrating that one interview, but very clearly there was a lot more going on. The story was bigger. It was like there were more people involved. There were more perspectives. We also had to find out, I realized it couldn't just be one-sided. This couldn't just be like Jeff talking about his memories and then that'd be the movie. So we had to do that, but he was very open to all of that. And it's what he would do is he would connect us with people. He'd say, hey, call this person, and he would set up an interview. He would hey, you should talk to these guys. We're making a documentary about me or whatever. But he would not try to go further than that. And he really there was at no point did he see edited footage before a crowd saw them. So we did events little fundraiser events when we were trying to kind of put this thing together, where I would cut a 10-minute or a 20-minute piece of footage together. And at no point did Jeff see it before he was in a room full of people watching it, and that was important to him. He didn't want to control it. So it's there was of course his personality was sort of enormous, and I think that he really was willing to give it over. I think he felt confident enough in his own legacy. I think he felt good enough in the things that he'd done in his life that if we interrogated that we would find something that he would not be especially upset about, I guess, So, yeah.
Well, the other thing is, he passed away 3 years into the making of the film, so there was another 6.5 years, and the film got more together, and
Yeah.
so I didn't really get to see or hear.
Well, another thing I want to add to that is that it's just that when yes, we lost Jeff in 2016, and we were still in the middle of the film, and a lot of things didn't come out. We literally didn't know about some of the things that had gone down with him in his organization at the end of his career, at any of that stuff, until after he passed and people started being more willing to talk about them. So that changed a lot of the dynamics there, and so. It was definitely a process that unfolded, the length of it change, like if we made the film in a short amount of time, it would have been a very different film no matter what.
That's a very interesting thing you just said, that people were more willing to talk about those last years after he was gone. Why do you think that was?
I think there was so again, I was not there. I only know what we've been told, but we talked to a lot of people, and we got the sense that the end of it, that his career ended a certain way, and there was a certain public face to the way his career ended, and a lot of people were willing to just let that be the official story, and nobody wanted to go further than that, and not in a negative way, just sort of like, let's just let that all go, sort of is a feeling that we had from certain folks, and it was not until, and Jeff again was not someone, he didn't have like an axe to grind, he had nobody, he was like, he really, a lot of the things that we found out afterwards never came up, and I think partly because he was not someone that complained, he was not someone that like felt like put upon, he was living his life in a different way, and so the story revealed itself to us kind of after the fact, and I don't know, we really tried hard because we talked to a lot of people that had very different views about what went down, and we just tried to navigate that as honestly as we could.
As a reporter, I know how much research and work went into putting together this extremely comprehensive picture of a time and place. How did you guys do that? Was it stuff from his collection? What archives did you? How long did just this amassing this history of the LGBT movement in Michigan take? It seems like it must have taken a tremendous amount of work.
Well,
Congratulations, Tracy.
I mean, on one hand, this is a film made by a bunch of straight, cis white guys. Like they're trying to tell the story and trying to understand the story, and so it's like we were coming from the outside, and we had a lot of help. We made a lot of connections on the inside. Right, and we had Jeff's personal story. We had Tim Reslov was an amazing resource in terms of kind of filling in the context, and that's why. We actually, there was earlier versions of the film had much more historical context, much more about both Detroit's LGBTQ history, but also sort of nationally. It's like, and probably it was like, I was interested in sort of expanding upon all that stuff and finding a place for, to me it was important to establish a context for where does Jeff fit into this entire story and, or this entire sort of movement. And so, I don't know, it was very much a kind of a journey for us in trying to figure out what was the best way to tell the story and what was the best way to balance the different perspectives we were hearing.
It must have been bittersweet, John, having lost your brother and the circumstances of the last years of his life, to hear this movie with so many people speaking so highly of him after he was gone. I mean, people spoke highly of him during his life, but I mean, it must have been bittersweet to hear all these testaments when it seemed like he felt very isolated at times at the end of his life.
I couldn't say bittersweet really. It was just it kind of was. It is what it was, and I was proud of the fact that people would comment on it. I was proud. And, he was an incredible human being. So it was just, no, I didn't have that feeling.
So I couldn't help wondering as I was watching this movie, and I think someone actually posed this question in the movie, what he would tell us if he were here now. And I couldn't help but wonder what he, and I know you may not want to speculate, but what he would say about the attacks on trans rights, about the things that are happening in our country right now.
Well, he'd be totally upset about it and pissed off. His whole thing was about inclusivity. That included trans people, included people of color, and he had issues with that within the community.
Yeah, I mean, the sense we got from a lot of people, both on record and off, was just that he was he caused problems within the movement for being so much in favor of inclusivity and so much in favor of supporting issues that at the time a lot of the donors did not want us to deal with. And so there was a sense of the people who would talk to us about it, and since some of them didn't want to be on camera, but we're just, you know, like that his vision had been, that basically all the stuff that he fought for, that people were so mad about, that he'd been vindicated by the way that you know, things had moved forward through history. But I do not want to speculate on what he would have to say about what's going on right now, but I would love to hear it. You know, yeah.
Yeah, he was doing intersectionality before that was a word that everybody
Right.
used.
Right.
Yeah, that was pretty impressive, and it's also
Well, and to specifically, he used his privilege. Like, he understood his place. He understood like his position and the value that his not just his media skills, but his sort of you know, his family upbringing. You know, that's. I do want to point that out, that I think that like there's something that the film sort of barely touches on, but the idea that he had a family that supported him, and I think that armed him, you know, to help other people. But yeah, in terms of that fight, like I don't want to speculate on what he would actually have to say.
It's sometimes surprising in 2022 to look back and realize how much early movements were still divided by things like racism or. So it was a really fascinating part of the movie.
Well, part of the inclusivity for him, within the gay community, there's different factions of, you know, people of color, trans, but if they're not all working together, the community isn't big enough to like take on the challenges of political leaders and that. And that's why it's really important for all the different groups to work together and unite for better progress.
Well, yeah.